PBS Utah presents the Governor's Monthly News Conference, an exchange between Utah reporters and Governor Gary Herbert.
Good morning. Great to see you all here. As you know, this Monday will be the beginning of the next legislative session. A lot of issues to be talked about. Education, how we're going to fund education, not only public but higher education. Health and Human Services, transportation, issues that we typically take on every year, so nothing will change in that regard. But as some of you know already, we've had the announcements go out that the first topic of discussion will be repealing Senate Bill 2001, known as the Tax Reform, Tax Modernization Bill. As we've gone through this process, the people have, in fact, not agreed with the tax reform proposal based on the referendum and the signatures being gathered. And rather than have a cloud hanging over the legislative session as far as what does that do to our budget, what's the long-term ramifications, in talking with the Senate President and the Speaker of the House yesterday, we decided the best course of action, reflecting the will of the people, is in fact to go back and push the restart button. Go back to square number one, repealing Senate Bill 2001 and starting over. I think we've learned some lessons in this process, and I think that will, in fact, serve us well going forward. I'd like to make just a couple of comments. One, the legislature took on a very difficult task. As you can imagine, again, this is complex. It had tax increases here and tax decreases there, and even though there was a net tax cut of $160 million, the tax increase on food was one that the people, I think, really objected to. But taking on tax reform, I would like to give kudos to the legislature. It's not an easy thing to do. I've mentioned here before, I think they'd rather have taken a beating than have to take on that task. But to their credit, they didn't shrink from the challenge. Tax modernization, tax fairness, equity, reflecting our modern economy is something that needs to be done. In fact, that will continue to be a challenge for us going forward. We repeal it, but we still have that issue that's there before us that needs to be addressed in some form or fashion sometime, and sooner rather than later. So I give credit to the legislature for taking on a very difficult task. Sometimes doing the right thing is not necessarily the popular thing. Secondly, I think it's an opportunity for those running for governor who in fact have been critical of this process. It's time for them to step up and let the public know, what are your ideas on tax reform? How are you going to address the new modern economy? And what are your proposals for tax reform? I think the public deserves to hear what their ideas and thoughts are in that regard, and so I would hope that they would in fact engage in this conversation as they campaign for this great office of governor. So with that, I think we're actually doing the right thing in the right way. We've got to lead, and we've got to bring those who we lead into some kind of consensus if we're going to do anything on tax reform and tax modernization. That will be the challenge for all of us going forward. With that, what questions do you have for me today?
So did you all blink?
What do you think killed this?
What?
Which one killed
Did you blink?
I don't know what that even means, Ben.
Did you blink in the face of a referendum? Is this just basically backing down from the referendum?
I don't think blinking. I think we're accommodating the will of the people. Blinking puts it in like we're some kind of big fight here. We're all Utahns. We want good policy on everything, including tax policy. So the fact that we have pushback means we've not done our job as far as convincing the people this is the right thing to do or the right way to do it, maybe all of the above. So it's a matter of saying, okay, let's see if we can come back together, working together and find the right tax policy that everybody can embrace.
What do you think killed it? The sales tax on food seemed to me to be really the big one.
I think you're right, Bob. I think the increase of the sales tax on food was really probably the catalyst that drove this issue. Even though there was an attempt to say, look, you get a $40 million credit now with not paying the tax on food, with all the things we're going to be doing and redirecting monies to the poor, you'll have $135 to $140 million benefit. It didn't translate. People didn't agree with that solution. And so I think that's the biggest issue, and we'll see what comes in the future. Clearly, the need to have structural balance and making sure we have fairness and equity in the system is a needful thing. And that quest will continue. It's not going to go away. So we just need to see what we can do to bring people together and find a better way that everybody can agree to.
Is that better way going to come during this upcoming legislative session, or is it going to take more time? That's one of the concerns I know a lot of people had, is there really wasn't a lot of time once the proposal was in place to comment on it.
Yes, I think the legislature worked very hard, even the session here a year ago, 45 days, working very hard with the House and the Senate. They couldn't come to an agreement on things, and concerns were raised at that time, even though we had 17 public hearings and 62 hours of commentary and discussion, and it was not enough. I think, who knows what the legislature will do. My crystal ball is a little foggy in that regard, but my belief would be it's probably not only push the reset button, but maybe the pause button. And let's take a breather and let's reflect upon where we've been and what we're trying to do and see if there's a better way to do it. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of energy to say, let's jump right back into the fire here and create some new policy.
Is that easier in light of traditional over budget? And what I mean by that is it easier since you have a surplus?
Well, the good news is we are financially stable. And the good news is we have the best, healthiest, the most diverse economy in America. So we've got a lot of good things going for us. This was an attempt to say we can see around the corner here we have some troubled waters. And is there an ability for us to be proactive before we hit the troubled waters and minimize whatever that problem would occur? And I think, we have a couple of years before that probably becomes a real acute problem. Whether it's a crisis or not, I don't know what the definition will be, but trying to be forward thinking is hard for politicians to do. And we have a hard time getting past the next election. So the visionary aspect of what this was attempting to do, I think we ought to appreciate. But I think people take a little bit of a pause now and say, let's see where this leads to and address more of this maybe through summer study, maybe in 2021 session, maybe come back and see if there's something we have some consensus. Hey, new governor. And so we'll see what the new governor has to say about this and what they would like to do in leading out.
There are a lot of strong emotions in this entire process. I read some of the tweets that were sent to you. They were very biting. In your news release, you said, we're not foes. What do you want to say to those people who gathered to sign these petitions? We have a great process here in the state of Utah, which allows the legislature to propose and pass legislation. There's the ability for the governor to veto as a check and balance, but there's also the will of the people. We all, in a republic, think that we should represent the people. It's a republic, though, because there's some areas that are difficult to understand, and we expect people that we elect to go there and do the deep dive analysis, to the research necessary to make the right decisions in creating the right policy. It's not a democracy. That's a little bit too emotional. But we do have a check and balance with the people. They can put a referendum in place. They can put initiatives in place. And so the voice of the people have spoken. It's put a cloud over the legislative session, and I think the wisdom would say, you know what, something's amiss here. Let's push the reset button. Let's not have this cloud. And we don't want to have a divisive argument in the state of Utah for the next 10 months. That won't be helpful for anybody. And so let's take a look at it. We have probably some time, and let's see if we can take a look at a fresher look and bring the public along and see if we come up with a better proposal.
Are you surprised with how much? What would you have done differently in terms of getting tax reform through? You initially proposed something very different than what we ended up with. You wanted to see sales tax rates dropped and that rate broadened over a wide range of services. We ended up with something very, very different than that. What would you have liked to have seen?
Well, my proposal was a little different. It was, in fact, to reflect the shifting of the marketplace from a product market to a more service-oriented market, which we've been warned about this by our economists, CPAs, those that are experts in this aspect of government since Olene Walker's time. saying that eventually it's going to catch up to you if you don't make some modifications. We already have 60 services that are taxed, by the way. This is not a new idea. But broadening the base and lowering the rate, absolute fairness would say every service should be taxed.
Were you surprised by? Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me finish. Thank you.
No problem.
Every service should be taxed, and then drop the rate. If every service was taxed, you might have a sales tax rate of less than 1%. You might pay more for a haircut, but you'd pay a heck of a lot less for your automobile, your furniture, and bigger ticket items. So again, but in politics, it's the art of the possible. What will, in fact, the market bear? What will the people be able to understand and support? You go through these processes all the time. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. We're all prone to make mistakes, and we find out and learn from our mistakes, pick ourselves up, and start over again. So it became a lot more complex than what I originally envisioned, but there is a good faith effort by the legislature to do it right, and I applaud them for their efforts. Now you.
Sorry. Were you surprised with how much support lined up behind the referendum in a short amount of time?
A little bit. Clearly, the grocery stores getting involved in the business, and again, accentuating only one aspect of the tax reform, the increase on tax on food. We never took off the rate or took it all off because there was issues with local governments and things. It was a debate when it was taken off back in 2007, or lowered the rate, and that's why we didn't take it off entirely. It's that would kind of put the magnifying glass on this, and the belief that somehow we're going to hurt the poor, which seemed to be the rallying cry, even though the belief was that not only will the poor not be hurt, but they'll get a significant benefit, not only in overcoming the cost of food, sales tax on food, but programs going to be helping them to, in fact, be given skills and education through our workforce services and get better training. The old adage of we're trying to help you learn to fish, not just give you a fish. So there's aspects of it that were good, not understood, and we didn't do a good job of explaining. And so, I think pushing the pause button, the reset, let's go back, let's bring everybody together and see what we come up with on another effort is probably wise and prudent, and what the public wants us to do.
You signed the bill, of course, but if you had your druthers, would you have included the sales tax on food, or would you have said, no, I don't want to do that?
My emphasis was on, in fact, broadening the base and lowering the rate. And I think we could have done that really with services. But again, it's not everybody sees the world like Gary Herbert does. And that's the beauty of our system. Everybody kind of weighs in, and we find consensus and build coalitions and finally get hopefully enough votes to pass the policy.
In this new program, whenever it happens, you may not even be in office, but would you recommend, because of what's happened here, that they try to put the sales tax back on food again?
I've never thought that was good policy. I think there's an easier way to do things, though. For example, for those who are below a certain income level, you ought to give them a card rather than a prebate or a rebate, which seems to be confusing to people and not convenient. If everybody that qualified got a card when you bought your groceries, you'd have this card that would allow you to, in fact, have an immediate deduction of the sales tax on food. So there may be some new ideas, new technology to allow it to be a little more convenient, less confusing. So I think it certainly ought to be on the table. Whether that's the right answer or not remains to be seen. But there's just a lot of aspects of this thing that probably need more discussion and see if we can build consensus.
What do you want to see happen on that education funding? There's been talk about removing the constitutional earmark on the income tax. Should that be paused as well?
Well, again, I've never advocated for that either, but and education has been my number one budget priority since I've been in office, and we've done very good by education. If this budget recommendation is approved by the legislature, it'll be $2.3 billion, nearly doubling the amount of money put into public education since I came into office. So we've done, a pretty good effort to get more money to education. That's with, in fact, the earmark, the constitutional earmark on income tax. We're the only state that has that. We're the only state that has an earmark on income tax, and we're constantly being told we're the lowest per pupil spending in the nation. So that certainly hasn't guaranteed the funding, as people would have liked to have more. But when I was at Wall Street here a few months ago, they brought up the fact that you know that you're the only state in America that has this earmark, and they would like more flexibility. They would like the legislature to have to make the tough decisions every time they come in to session, not have money that's been earmarked, whether it be education or transportation or other areas, to be set aside so they don't have to make the tough decisions. That's probably better policy. That being said, we're unique in Utah. And mostly that uniqueness has led us to good outcomes, better outcomes. We are by far the most diverse, healthy economy in America today. We have the largest middle class of any state in America today. We have now the lowest tax burden that we've had in Utah in 27 years. We have upward mobility, the American dream, the best of any state in America. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So these people in the legislature and governors, present and past, have led to this great, lofty position that we have here in America today. They want to continue that. They don't want to destroy that. So I think the intentions are good. We'll see what comes up in the future.
Does this mean that basically a budget you just recommended is just thrown out? Because that was with all the new numbers in it.
No, I don't think so at all. I think, in fact, the budget will be very similar to what I've proposed. I think we've made a very, very rational and reasonable budget. And I think the legislature will embrace most of it. All that really happens now is the $160 million tax cut will not happen, which means that we literally will have more money to spend. And so that doesn't mean we need to spend it all. We need to save for the rainy day, which we're very good at doing. We're a very structurally sound budget from the standpoint we don't use one-time money for ongoing needs, which many states do. We have rational debt. We're one of only 12 states that have a AAA bond rating from all the rating agencies on Wall Street. Even the United States doesn't have that anymore. So we're a pretty fiscally prudent, a very dynamic, growing economy with a great quality of life. That will continue.
Governor, why did you decide to stop the Department of Health's campaign on HIV awareness, particularly with the Utah-themed condoms? And were you inserting your own personal moral beliefs in a public health campaign?
You know, I think we all recognize, Ben, the importance of HIV awareness and AIDS prevention. I don't think anybody doesn't agree with that I know of. But there's a right way to go about the awareness campaign for government, and there's probably maybe a wrong way to do it. As I found out about this, one, it hadn't gone through the proper protocol and procedures to get a thumbs up on going ahead with it. And two, as I read the sexual innuendos and the double entendre and kind of the crass messages on the packages, I thought, I don't know if this is what we want to do as government. If you're going to have, a novelty shop and somebody in the private sector thinks that's a great way to approach this thing, fine, let them. But government ought not to do something that, many of the people think are offensive. And so I thought there's just a better way to spend the money. I thought it was interesting that one of the critics of my proposal said, hey, well, this is not taxpayers' dollars. This is coming from a federal grant. Clearly, the ignorance is profound in thinking that somehow because it went through the federal government that it's not taxpayers' dollars that are generated even here in Utah. So again, I just think that we ought to be more professional in it. We certainly understand the seriousness of the issue, and we want to make sure that our awareness proposal reflects that seriousness. The word slut, in the age of Me Too, all of us ought to be offended by that.
Where was the breakdown of the procedure?
Don't know exactly. We're having a review of that process now to see what happened, but it did not get to the final echelon for determination. I was certainly not consulted. We're doing a review of that, and we'll see what I find out after that review is completed.
The health department has not been super clear yet. Has someone lost their job? Is someone going to lose their job? Are people on leave because of this?
I can clarify that for you right now. Nobody's lost their job. I know that people had good intentions on this. This is not somebody trying to be nefarious and do something stupid. Probably not as wise. We all make mistakes. That happens to all of us, and this may be one that happened in the Department of Health. So Nobody's lost their job, and I don't anticipate anybody will lose their job.
Do you think there need to be changes in the referendum law, or is that, it's different than the initiative law, as you probably know, in several ways. So should it stand as it is, or should it be changed to become more exactly like the initiative law as far as Senate districts instead of counties and the percent and all of that kind of stuff?
You know, I haven't even thought about that. They seem to work. We've had initiatives and we've had referendums. Whether there needs to be any modification of that, I guess, in light of what's taken place, maybe somebody will give that some thought. I haven't. I think it's worked really good as a check and balance on the legislature.
One of the problems, though, with the recent change to the referendum law is tax reform would have actually taken effect for about a month before you, as governor, through executive order, would have been able to put it on hold for a referendum election, and that was the time period where checks were going to be sent out, where all kinds of things would have had to be put in place under that law. So doesn't that need to be fixed, that weird gap?
Well, this is kind of unique because it's about tax reform, and it does impact your budget. It could be a referendum on other policies that have been passed. Vouchers comes to mind, you know, and other issues. So this is probably a one-off, unique situation, but maybe that's something that ought to be addressed. I've not heard it discussed by anybody in the legislature. I've not brought it up. Maybe it's worth at least a review.
Taking a step back to the HIV campaign for just a second, I spoke with some public health folks in Wyoming this week who had a very similar campaign. They did loop in some of their elected leaders on it, who sort of had a right of first refusal on some of the designs. And since then, they said theirs has been a huge success. Would that have changed things in this situation here? Probably.
Again, if we had veto power, there might be some that would be acceptable as far as the cover packages and what they were doing, and others not. I've seen some from Wyoming and Alaska. I don't think they were near as offensive as what we had in some of ours here in Utah. So yeah, again, I get it. You know, I understand the intentions are to help, you know, with a little bit of humor, to bring about a little better awareness. I just think we went over the line in Utah. And so back to the drawing board.
You said that some of the governor's candidates now should step up and let people know how tax reform should take place. Of course, Lieutenant Governor Cox is running, and while you may not have endorsed him formally, you have given money to his campaign. Did you and he talk about this before you sent out this press release and made the decision that we're just going to repeal this?
You know, we've had discussions along the way. He had some concerns on the tax reform. He would say to you, I think, that there's a lot of good things in it, but some things he couldn't support. Therefore, he was opposed. But he's independent. He's not a clone of me. And he has to make his own way and convince people why they should vote for him, just like everybody else has that same opportunity. I think he's well qualified, and he's been a great lieutenant governor, and I think he'd be a good governor. So, but that's why we have elections. So we'll see what happens there.
Were there any alternatives to a straight-up repeal of tax reform that were talked about when you met with legislative leadership? Was this the only way forward, or could there have been some kind of maybe a tax cut with no changes to deal with the budget imbalance, for example?
Yeah, there was. Could we just modify, tweak it here or there, and come back with a new and improved approach? That was certainly talked about. I think the concern was that there was so much confusion about the issue. The old adage, if you're explaining, you're losing. So I think the wisdom was, you know, what we need to do is just go back to square one. We can do this. It's not going to go away, but let's see if we can't bring more people into the discussion and find a better proposal for tax reform. And that seemed to be the consensus. I think it made the legislature feel like they didn't have the pressure. A lot of things we need to talk about in this session, and that's one of the reasons they wanted to have a special session. Let's get this off the table so we can concentrate on other things during the legislative session. I don't think they wanted to have this to be the focus and the sole thing that they were going to talk about. And so probably a little easier, maybe a little wiser to say, let's just set it aside. Let's go back to square one, repeal it, and start over.
Isn't it hard, though, to take back a tax cut in an election year? I know having that tax cut in place was also one of the reasons that legislative leadership wanted to see a special session. The in the prior year, so Utahns could start seeing a little break in their paychecks.
We've given tax cuts in the past, as I mentioned, because of good management, economic growth, efficiency in government, which we don't talk about much. We have fewer state employees today. You have to go back 2001, and that's in the face of 900,000 more people calling Utah home. Government is labor intensive. We've reduced labor significantly in the state of Utah. So there is a need and a demand, and I think a desire to give a tax cut. But it's going to be part of a whole tax reform movement, and so I think there's certainly energy to do that. It just didn't work with this tax reform package.
You just said that'll be part of it, but will it really? It is an election year. You're not up, but all the House is up and half the Senate is up. They've got $160 million that they were not going to put in the budget. You think they might just turn around and cut the income tax and not do anything else? Repeal this and then turn around and cut the income tax?
Who knows, Bob? You've been around long enough to know
you
that
recommend they do
it's a
that?
little hard to be predictable on that. I've not heard anybody propose that. Let's scrap the tax reform and come back and give a $160 million tax cut. I think it really is part of an entire package that's more complex than just that. But we'll see what happens. I know there's a desire to, in fact, give more money back to the public because we have some surplus money.
Thank you so much for your time and for being here, Governor.
Thank you. Good luck to all of you.
Hope you have a better day.
This has been the Governor's Monthly News Conference, an archive of transcripts, video, and audio.